In the heart of New York City, a place once alive with endless lights and unstoppable noise, silence fell like a heavy blanket, broken only by the distant echo of screams and the restless shuffling of creatures that were no longer human. Skyscrapers that had once touched the clouds now stood like empty guardians over streets filled with broken cars, shattered windows, and the faint smell of smoke drifting from forgotten fires. The city that never slept was now wide awake in terror, ruled not by people, but by zombies that had poured into every corner, every alley, every subway line, consuming everything in their path. At first, the government thought they could stop it. Military barricades were set up across Manhattan. Soldiers stood armed in Times Square. Helicopters circled the Hudson. But all of it fell apart within days as the infected overwhelmed the defenses like a tide no wall could hold back. Families were torn apart in the chaos. Crowds fled across bridges only to be trapped in endless traffic. And the tunnels that once carried trains now carried whispers of survivors hiding in the dark. Among them was Ethan Cole, a mechanic with grease-stained hands and tired eyes, who never imagined he would one day be more than an ordinary worker fixing engines and machines. He had no weapon training, no soldier's skill, but what he had was instinct. And in the crumbling ruins of New York, instinct mattered more than strength. He found himself in an abandoned subway station near Brooklyn, huddled with a small group of strangers who had become his only family in the disaster. There was Mara, a former nurse who treated wounds with scraps of cloth. Jackson, a college student who carried an old baseball bat like it was his last lifeline. And 3 others who had survived only because Ethan had guided them through streets where shadows moved faster than light. He never wanted to lead them, but each time the group faced danger, it was Ethan who made the decisions. When to run. Where to hide, how to fix broken doors that held the creatures back for a few more hours. Above them, the city screamed, but below, in the tunnels, the survivors clung to hope that maybe someone out there still fought for them. Yet as days stretched into weeks, it became clear. No help was coming. The radios were dead, the soldiers were gone, and the sound of helicopters had long vanished. The city was lost. Ethan stood in the darkness, staring at the map of subway lines and felt a weight pressed down on his chest. He knew that survival here would not last. Supplies were running out, and the creatures were learning. At first, they had been mindless, wandering aimlessly, but now they gathered in groups, moving together as though guided by something unseen, and that change terrified him more than the outbreak itself. It meant there was a design, a pattern, a force pushing them forward. One night, as the survivors huddled close, listening to the hollow moans echo through the tunnels, the walls trembled with the weight of hundreds above. Dust rained from the ceiling, lights flickered, and the air grew thick with fear. The barricade they had built from metal doors and broken furniture rattled under pressure as if tested by unseen hands. Jackson gripped his bat tighter, Mara whispered prayers, and Ethan pressed his ear to the wall, trying to measure how close death had come. Then it happened. The barricade gave way, the sound of splintering metal echoing through the chamber, and the darkness filled with the groans of the dead. Panic erupted, but Ethan's voice cut through like steel. "This way!" he shouted, guiding the group through narrow maintenance tunnels, his mind racing, his heart pounding. They ran past graffiti-marked walls, through ankle-deep water, past the remnants of lives long gone, abandoned backpacks, broken phones, a child's toy floating in the muck. Behind them, the zombies poured like a wave, their footsteps uneven but relentless. Ethan pushed the group harder, every second a battle between survival and surrender, until they burst into an old maintenance room lit only by the glow of a single cracked bulb. Breathing hard, the survivors pressed against the door as Ethan jammed the lock with his wrench, his hands shaking but precise. For a moment, silence returned, and in that silence, realization grew heavy in everyone's eyes. If the barricades above had fallen, if the military had lost, then there was no one left to fight for New York. It was only them now, a handful of humans against an endless city of the dead. Ethan looked at the tired faces around him, at the fear and desperation, and something inside him shifted. He was no soldier, but he knew machines. He knew survival, and maybe, just maybe, he knew enough to keep them alive a little longer. Outside, the groans rose again, and the city seemed to breathe in hunger, waiting for the moment to devour what little remained of humanity. For Ethan Cole, it was no longer about fixing engines or machines. It was about fixing survival itself. And in the ruins of New York City, his choices would decide if humanity had any last stand left at all. Ethan Cole stood in the dim maintenance room, the cracked bulb buzzing faintly above his head, as if mocking the fragile hope his group still held. And though exhaustion pulled at every muscle, his mind refused to rest, because the groans outside had not faded. They had only grown stronger, heavier, like a storm pressing against weak walls. The survivors sat in silence, their faces pale in the flickering light, and Ethan could feel their fear settling like dust in the air, choking them more than the stench of decay. He knew hiding would not save them, not anymore, because the zombies were changing. Their movements in the tunnels had been too organized, too precise, and it was Mara who whispered the thought everyone feared. "They're learning." The words hung like a shadow, and Ethan could not dismiss them, for he had seen it himself, the way the creatures moved in unison, as though guided by an unseen signal. That thought led him to remember rumors he had overheard before the city fell, whispers of secret labs near Wall Street where experiments on viral frequencies had been carried out. Tests that were never meant to escape the walls of science, but now had consumed an entire city. If there was a source behind the coordination, perhaps it could be stopped, and though Ethan was no soldier, his instincts as a mechanic screamed that machines could be broken, signals could be disrupted, and if that was true, then maybe humanity still had a chance. Gathering his courage, he told the others of his plan, his voice firm even as doubt gnawed at him. They needed to reach one of the tall skyscrapers, climb to the rooftop, and send a signal strong enough to disrupt whatever force was controlling the horde. The survivors stared at him in disbelief, for the idea sounded impossible, yet in their hearts they knew waiting in the tunnels meant death. So after a long silence, they agreed not because they believed in success, but because Ethan's determination gave them a reason to move forward. With supplies gathered, flashlights, a half-empty water jug, a few tools, and Jackson's worn baseball bat, they stepped back into the darkness, moving carefully through the skeletal remains of a city once alive with dreams. The tunnels led them upward, until they emerged into the open streets, and for the first time in days, they saw the sky a gray canvas, painted with smoke, and the ruins of New York spread out before them like a nightmare frozen in time. Times Square flickered with broken billboards, showing half-lit advertisements, the glowing eyes of zombies reflecting against shattered glass, and silence followed them with every step, until it was broken by the guttural growl of a creature lurking near an overturned bus. The group froze, hearts pounding, but Ethan signaled them to stay low, leading them through alleys lined with graffiti and abandoned taxis, each corner a gamble between life and death. As they passed Central Park, the once green heart of the city had become a battlefield of shadows, with hordes drifting like restless waves, their heads twitching as if listening to an unheard command. Ethan realized then that time was running out, for the creatures seemed to know where survivors were hiding, as though pulled by invisible strings. Pushing forward, they finally reached the edge of Wall Street, its skyscrapers looming like silent giants, and among them was one tower taller than the rest, its rooftop the only place high enough to broadcast a signal across the city. But the streets around it swarmed with zombies, dozens, maybe hundreds, their movements sharper, more deliberate, blocking every possible path. "We'll never make it through," Jackson muttered, gripping his bat. sweat dripping from his brow, yet Ethan's eyes burned with something stronger than fear. He remembered every machine he had ever repaired, every broken engine he had brought back to life, and he refused to believe that a city of humans could not be fixed. Guiding his group into a side street, he spotted an old fire escape clinging to the side of a nearby building, rusted but still standing, and he pointed upward. "We climb," he said simply, and without another word, they began their ascent, metal groaning under their weight as the horde below shifted, sensing their presence. Higher and higher they climbed, the city spreading out like a graveyard beneath them, until finally they reached the rooftop of the skyscraper that faced the tower they needed to enter. From this vantage point, they could see the ocean of zombies gathered below, their heads all turning in eerie unison, their glowing eyes fixed upward at the survivors, waiting for the inevitable. Ethan felt his chest tighten, for he knew this was not just survival anymore. This was humanity's last stand, a battle not fought with guns or armies, but with courage and the will to resist. As night fell, the skyline burned with distant fires, and the survivors prepared themselves for what was to come. The part ended with Ethan staring across at the towering building that held their only hope, the horde below growing restless, and a single thought running through his mind. If he failed, New York City would remain a tomb forever, but if he succeeded, humanity would rise again. Ethan Cole and his group stared at the towering building across the street, their eyes reflecting the flickering fires and the glowing eyes of the restless horde below. And though exhaustion clawed at their bodies, he knew there was no turning back, for this was humanity's final chance to fight, not with weapons of destruction, but with their will and ingenuity. And he whispered to the others, "We climb, we reach the signal, and we end this," his voice firm despite the pounding of his heart. Step by step, they scaled the fire escapes, metal groaning under weight, zombies below twisting and lunging at shadows, their growls forming a terrifying symphony that echoed through the ruined streets of New York, and with every level they climbed, the tension grew unbearable, each footstep a gamble between life and death. When they finally reached the rooftop of the skyscraper, the wind whipping around them, they saw the abandoned transmitter in the corner, cables torn and screens dark, a relic of a world that had forgotten its purpose. Yet Ethan refused to be intimidated, digging through his bag for tools, wires, and scraps of metal, anything that could help him repair it. As Mara and Jackson kept watch, zombies pressing closer with each passing second, Ethan worked tirelessly, twisting wires, reconnecting circuits, improvising solutions he had only ever imagined in engines and machines, and slowly the screen flickered to life, a pale glow illuminating his determined face. The horde below shifted, more restless than ever, as if sensing the activation, and Ethan knew there was no more time for hesitation. He flipped the final switch, and the transmitter hummed, sending out a pulse of energy that spread across the city like lightning through veins, and immediately the zombies froze in place, their heads turning unnaturally as if something unseen controlled their bodies. Then, one by one, their glowing eyes dimmed, their limbs slackened, and they collapsed in silence, leaving the streets eerily empty. The city finally quiet except for the wind and distant fires, a moment so surreal that the survivors barely breathed, afraid to break it. Ethan lowered himself to the ground, wiping sweat and grime from his brow, looking out at the city that had almost been lost, and slowly the realization sank in. Humanity had survived not because of strength or armies, but because of determination, courage, and a mind willing to fight when everything else had failed. From the rooftops and hidden corners, people emerged cautiously, blinking in disbelief, eyes wide with hope, and Ethan saw them. Ordinary men and women who had waited, hidden, watching, realizing that their world had not ended, that the human spirit had not been defeated, and that a small group of survivors, guided by will and ingenuity, had turned the tide. Across the city, signals from the transmitter spread further, reaching other isolated survivors, allowing them to coordinate and regroup. And slowly, a sense of unity began to build, as though the pulse of hope had reignited humanity's connection to itself. Ethan looked at Mara, Jackson, and the others, feeling a mixture of relief and exhaustion, knowing that the battle was not over, that New York City would need rebuilding, healing, and vigilance. But for the first time since the outbreak began, he allowed himself a small smile because the impossible had been achieved. The streets were still dangerous, the world outside the city in unknown peril, yet Ethan realized that the human spirit was far stronger than any horde, any virus, any impossible odds, and he whispered to himself as he gazed across the skyline, "We fight, we survive, we rise," knowing that this was only the beginning of a story that would remind everyone in the galaxy, humanity cannot be underestimated. And in that moment, standing above the city with the wind biting his face, Ethan understood that New York had not fallen. The dead had been stopped and a spark had been lit that could never be extinguished. The last stand had shocked the world, proving that the strength of humans, their courage, and their unity was something no enemy living or undead could ever take away.